Hello BookTube, it's Andrea and today I'm going to do my November wrap-up, which includes what I read for non-fiction November and of course a bit of a December TBR. So I gotta admit I didn't read much in November, I just wasn't in the mood for reading. And I didn't read as much non-fiction as I would have liked to. I completed 2 non-fiction books and 3 fiction books, which is 5, and started a couple more books. So we'll crack on with the non-fiction books that I read in November. If you watched the update, the one update I did, yeah, I've been really lax, but I'm back now. And that was Acropolis, London and It's Dead by Catherine Arnold. This is just a book about London and the dead of London. So it explores funeral funerary practices from the early days of London right up to the modern day, including the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, and what happened there. How a lot of what we still use is brought on by the Victorians and what the Victorians did. We are still very much influenced by Victorian society today, even in the 21st century. The wearing black was a Victorian thing. The hearses decked out in black were a Victorian thing. Permanent burials were a Victorian thing. Prior to that, people were buried for so long, then their bones were dug up and placed into ossuaries, much like the catacombs of Paris, where they would dig them up and they put them, therefore clearing space. But when it came to the Victorian era, suddenly the dead became more important and respected. So it was the first time when we started to see permanent memorials for the deceased, only particularly if you were rich. If you were poor, you put up with what you got, which was usually a pit burial or a pauper's burial, which was be like 30 or 40 people in one pit. Generally, the rich had beautiful monuments and crypts, and it tells you all about those. Arnisvale, where my grandparents are buried, there are some beautiful, that is a Victorian garden cemetery, there are some beautiful graves there. But the poor, and it's in a reversal of upstairs downstairs, because Arnisvale's built on a hill, is that the poor people were buried up the hill and the rich were down at the bottom on in the lush grounds. So everyday people were up, and which is a complete reversal from the usual upstairs downstairs thing that we see in Victorian society. And it tells of how deep they thought graves should be dug, and what happened to graves when they were graveyards when they were full. Very, very fascinating if you're interested in anything to do with death and funerary practices, otherwise known as tapophilia, or even in London's history. It's a nice little segment of that said history. The second book I read is one I've wanted to read for a very, 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 very long time, and we're talking years, not months, and that's Clara Running Wild by David Sten. Clara was the it girl of the 1920s. Basically, a writer named Ella Glynn wrote a book called It. It is sexual magnetism. Clara embodied that, and it tells the story of her rise from her poverty-stricken childhood in Brooklyn, New York, to her untimely and sad death at the age of only 60 in California. She was pretty much whitewashed out of Hollywood because she wasn't a hypocrite like most Hollywood people were and still are, whereas most of the Hollywood stars did similar things to what she did, sexually. I mean, they kept it to themselves. Clara just did not care. She was just out there, this is me, take me as I am or go away. And unfortunately she was vilified for that, and it wasn't until the late 60s that she started coming back and people started writing about her again. Louise Brooks was one of her greatest advocates. And in fact in one book, I think it was Kenneth Tynam's book on Hollywood, she was completely written out of the Hollywood history. And it was only when he made the TV version of it that she was put back into it. Just because of the amount of scandals that she had. In an era where morals clauses were written into movie star contracts, Clara did not have one. She refused. She wouldn't sign a contract with a morals clause. They got around it in other ways, but she didn't have one. But it's a horrible story. I was crying by the end of the first chapter because her mother was abused, and by her father, and he, not sexually but physically abused, and so she married to get away from that, and then her husband was just as bad, and then she had a daughter, Clara, who's, funny enough, the grandfather doted on Clara Bow, and it was the only love she ever felt because her father hated her and her mother hated her, and in fact her mother tried to kill her twice when she was a youngster. So her mother was mentally ill, so was Clara, but in those days there was just no word for it. There was no treatment, there was nothing, and it was very, very sad story, but you know, fantastic woman. She was one of those stars who, she didn't mind other stars, she didn't feel particularly threatened by them. She was originally threatened by Jean Harlow when Jean Harlow was cast in the film Saturday Night Kid, but she grew to love Jean. By the time that Marilyn came around, she was obviously very much retired by then, and Marilyn did want to portray her in a film, and Clara Bow said, no, not while I'm still living. But she did portray her in Richard Avedon's Set Pictures fabled Enchantresses of the Screen, and she looks fabulous. But Clara Bow actually felt that Marilyn was the only worthy successor to the title of It, and was very sad when Marilyn died. She outlived Marilyn by 3 years. And in fact, one of her most famous quotes of Clara Bow's is, being a sex symbol is a heavy burden to carry, especially when one is tired, hurt and bewildered. And she said that about not just herself, but about Marilyn and Marilyn's death. So it's a fantastic biography. David Stent is an amazing biographer. He wrote the brilliant biography Bombshell, which is about her first successor, Jean Harlow, which we will be featuring fairly shortly on this channel, because I've been asked to do a spotlight, so I will. If you're interested in old Hollywood and fascinated with the silent era, do give it a read. It's a tragic story, but Clara comes off as a really likeable woman. You really want her to succeed. So it's just really, really sad. So I also read that book. I did start Jack the Ripper and the East End, which is a book mostly about the conditions of the East End in the 1880s when Jack the Ripper stalked Whitechapel, but I haven't finished it because I really wasn't in a reading mood towards the end of the month. And I did also start Can't Buy Me Love, The Beatles, Britain and America by Jonathan Gould. It's a very thick book. I've hardly read anything. I've got to be honest, I really just was not in a reading mood in November at all. So I will be plodding on with this. It's going to take me a few months to get through, I think. On to the 3 fiction books that I completed. Two of them were, well, 3 of them were review copies. 2 of them were physical copies and 1 was an ebook. The first book was In the Dark by Andreas Fluger. This was sent to me by Head of Zeus, as was the next book on the list. Basically, this is a story about a woman who works for an elite government agency in Germany, sort of like a police force but more secretive, and she is blinded and wounded in action. And then 5 years later she's asked to come back and help solve a similar mystery, and it does revolve around the person who blinded her and what went on and why everything went wrong. It starts off really weird. It's a really strangely written book, and I think it's because our protagonist, who is blind, obviously things aren't clear to her. You know, she's got certain clarity, she's trained herself to do things because of her discipline, but you feel blind going into this book. You have no idea. It jumps around what's going on, and it is like a person's fragmented memories, and it really works really, really well. So that was a really good book. And the next book again was from Head of Zeus, and that was Adam Labour's District 8. This is set in Budapest during the migrant crisis they recently had a couple of years ago, where they shut down Colette Station and would not move any trains because of people trying to cross from East Europe to West Europe, so trying to get from like Hungary and into Germany, France and the UK. And it revolves around this one officer who is a detective in the murder squad, but he's also a gypsy, so he's sort of an outcast because he's an outcast with the gypsies because he's a cop, and he's an outcast with the cops because he's a gypsy. And those two things generally don't go together. But we follow his story as he tracks down this body that he has sent a photograph of, and the body just disappears. And it turns out to be the body of a migrant. It's a story of people trafficking, basically, and how they make money from getting people to pay to be transported across borders, fake passports, terrorism. It's all in here. It's an exceptionally well written book. I really enjoyed it and do highly recommend this book, even though it was sent to me free of charge and I've submitted that. I did really enjoy it. It was very griping. So District 8 by Adam Labor, very good. The fifth and final book I read was a book from NetGalley, again in exchange for a free review, and I've left my notebook in the other room with the author's name in it. Oops. I'll just go and get that and I'll be right back. So I've just got to finish my November wrap up because I went to edit it this morning only to discover that I somehow have deleted the last part of it, which was about a book called The Locket. I will put a picture up here because it was a Kindle book, so I don't know what happened. The Locket is by Patricia Keeson, and it tells the story of a girl named Rachel. Rachel goes car booting one day and picks up this package of stuff for like a tenner or 15 quid, and in it she finds an old locket. Now she splits up with her boyfriend, he leaves her, and leaves her in the lurch because he helped her to run the cafe that she owned. She would like to turn the cafe into a restaurant, and so she has these expansion plans. She meets a new guy, he's an estate agent. They get together and you know, they talk about this locket and the things that might have happened, the people that might have owned it in the past. And then the story goes back to the past and tells the story of the locket and how it came to be. And it starts with a lady named Maud, and who gave her the locket and what it symbolised, and then it follows it down through the generations. Her daughter has it, and her daughter loses it in France during World War I. It's then discovered by another soldier in World War II, and so on, and we have the 60s and the 80s. And I have these different women owning the locket and their relationships with the men they come into contact with and their families. And they put up this whole massive backstory for this locket. And then of course we come back to the modern day where Rachel successfully opens up her cafe as a restaurant and still going out with this guy. So what did I think of the book? Well, I enjoyed it. It was a very good book. I thought the beginning was a little bit naff to start with. I was reading thinking, really? This isn't really very well written. But as soon as we got onto the historical fiction side of it, we went back to the 1800s and met Maud, it really picked up. The writing was absolutely excellent there. The historical fiction aspects were amazing. I really enjoyed it right through all the different decades. Like we had the 1800s, we had the 1900s, we had the 1940s, the 1960s and so on. And I thought each one was done really well. It was fantastically written. And then when we got back to Rachel, I thought that bit was written better as well. I think it just took Patricia Keeson a while to get into her stride with this book. But I really enjoyed it. I would recommend picking it up. It's a nice, easy read for this time of year. You just chill out with it, curl up in a corner with a nice hot mug of chocolate, hot chocolate, and just sit there and read it. So those were the 5 books I read in November. I did pick one out of my TBR jar. The book I picked out of the TBR jar was Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. Now hopefully that won't be too difficult for me to read because I recently saw the play because Newport Playgoers did it earlier this year. So I will be pulling that out and trying to read that in December. I'm not going to guarantee it because I've still got quite a lot to read left over from non-fiction November. So that's it really. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm sorry it's been chopped around in this manner. It's just I somehow managed to delete the section or put it in another video. I'm not actually sure what I did with it. But those were the 5 books I read in November. I hope to read more in December. I'm at 2 books at the moment, I think, but more of that at the end of the month. So let me know what you've been reading. If you've read any of the books, let me know what you think of them, and I will see you all soon.